Okay, welcome to the Ipieca hosted virtual roundtable on net zero emissions. I'm Jim Herbertson, Technical Director of Climate and Energy here at Ipieca, and I will be the moderator today. So firstly, some housekeeping notes while people assemble. So if we go to the next slide, please, Jack. As always, a reminder about antitrust and a slide with which you should all be familiar by now. I'll leave people time to read the do's and the don'ts. If you feel the discussion is straying into sensitive areas, please speak up and we will stop. Remember, this reminder is there for your protection as well as that of your company. Next slide, please. Secondly, the meeting process. We will be recording the session to be able to share with members in Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific who can't make this roundtable live. We'll write up a short summary of the roundtable and share both the recording and the summary with all the registrants. And please follow the instructions on the slide and keep mute when not speaking. Turn the video on when speaking. That's optional, of course, depending on your Wi-Fi quality. And use the raise hand or chat function, and that will help with the Q&A. Next slide. So this is the agenda. So many thanks to you all for attending, to the speakers and panelists for taking time out to prepare and present, and to the Ipieca Net Zero Emissions Task Force, led by Peter Metcalf of Woodside Energy, for putting the event together. The Ipieca Task Force started up this year and put together a series of events to educate and inform our members around net zero. And now we have this roundtable to convene not just our own members, but also some external stakeholders to look at net zero from a range of perspectives that are of importance to the oil and gas sector. You can see that we have 3 sessions and a keynote introduction. Each session has a dedicated time for Q&A, so please try and make this as interactive as possible. We have some great speakers, and this is your opportunity to tap into their knowledge and expertise. And we'll introduce each session as we go along. As you know, Ipieca was set up in 1974 to be the voice of the global oil and gas industry, both upstream and downstream, in front of UNEP and other UN institutions. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mark Radka of UNEP, with whom Ipieca has a long-standing relationship. Mark is the acting director of the UNEP Economy Division, and prior to that headed the Energy and Climate branch, and so is a perfect speaker to kick off the proceedings. So I hope you're on the line, and over to you, Mark.
I am indeed.
So great.
Thank you very, very much, Jim and Ipieca colleagues. So it's a great pleasure to be with you today. I have chosen for the topic, or the title anyway, of the introductory remarks here, the zigzag to zero, are the positive pathways converging? Some recent events and trends point toward convergence, and they suggest that change is coming, possibly very quickly. And this is, from an environmental and climate perspective, very encouraging. But before I get to the good news, I think a review of a little bit of what I would call the bad news, or the state of affairs, is warranted. So if we could go to the next slide. So the big picture is, of course, something known to pretty much everybody in the audience, or everyone, I'd posit, and that is that the world is not on track to achieve the Paris Agreement targets. No news to this audience again. This is a graphic from the 2020 edition of UNEP's emission gap report, which we have produced for well over a decade now. The emission gap report looks at the gap between what the hard-headed science tells us about what is the necessary trajectory that we need to be on to be consistent with a reasonable chance of achieving the temperature goals, and where we really are when you do the not insubstantial math of adding up all the commitments by countries and non-state actors. So where do we need to be, and when you add up the tally or do the tallying, where do we see that the reality is? The report shows that temperatures will increase by 3.2 degrees with the current level of ambition, and that the NDCs need to be enhanced something like 3 to 5 times to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And hence a great deal of talk in the UN and climate circles about increasing ambition. There is some movement to strengthen NDCs, but the ambition is nowhere near commensurate with what is needed. And note that this slide really only goes through 2030. It was our intention in UNEP from the beginning to focus on near-term actions that were consistent with long-term goals. So this does not really go out to net zero by 2050, again, because the focus is on what can be done immediately, not allowing anyone who has to take a decision to kind of foist off onto future decision makers things that need to be decided today. If we could go to the next slide, please. 2 years ago, we decided to take a kind of different look, complementary to the emission gap report, and started working with a number of institutions on something called the production gap report. The name is a bit of a misnomer because it's not so much a gap as it's the production overshoot, comparing production plans and projections with both current climate pledges and the trajectories that we need to be on to achieve that 1.5 degree target. The production gap report draws from multiple sources of information, things like securities filings, shareholder reports, information provided by governments and released into the public domain, information provided to financial institutions as part of financing packages and so on. So what we are seeing here is instead of what needs to be an average 6% annual decline in the emission of greenhouse gases, a projected increase of 2% a year based on plans of oil and gas companies and oil and gas producing countries. And this would, rather than get us on the right path, actually increase by a factor of 2. So a doubling by 2030, the production that's consistent with the 1.5 degree limit. So very strong evidence, if you look at these two slides, of what we would call a policy disconnect, policy incoherence, or if you're not very charitable, some kind of schizophrenia. And the next slide, I don't want this to be all gloom and doom. So the news is that there I would say convincing or persuasive or certainly encouraging evidence of shifts on the political front, shifts in civil society and shifts in finance. Now, we'll hear more about details in some of these areas from other speakers, but let me just give a few highlights. Very important to UNEP, because we work with the International Energy Agency on a number of fronts, is the IEA's Net Zero by 2050 report, which in its summary for policymakers in a bolded headline stated that there is no need for investment in new fossil fuel supply in our net zero pathway. So this is, I think, very interesting and important statement to come out of IEA to the investment community. And IEA added in the report as well, beyond projects already committed as of 2021, there are no new oil and gas fields approved for development in our pathway, and no new coal mines or mine extensions are required. So coming from a historically conservative organization, this is rather powerful messaging. Also on the political front, we have within the UN system or at the intergovernmental level, the high-level dialogue on energy that would be held in New York as part of the UN General Assembly. This is a heads of state discussion, the first on energy to occur within the UN context in 40 years. And it will look at the energy transition and also areas such as expanded energy access to underserved or communities that currently lack access to modern energy. You could look as well at the joint statement, I think it came out yesterday, or from the G20 finance ministers meeting, which endorses the use of carbon pricing mechanisms among its policy prescriptions. The French finance minister was quoted by Reuters as saying, "It is the first time in a G20 communique you could have these two words, carbon pricing, being introduced as a solution to the fight against climate change." And U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said that she will be meeting with the heads of the multilateral development banks to press for stronger steps on climate change. So that's those are all within the political realm, but you could equally look into the social, let's say the social side of things, youth activism. Polls that reveal particularly younger people they need no convincing about the need to change. Climate is a priority in more and more polls. The mainstream media coverage of extreme weather events, I mean, the list is long, and I won't dwell on it. But important, I think, to this audience is the finance sector. So let me give a few examples of changes that have come about from within the UNEP Finance Initiative. So three different initiatives, in a sense, all aimed at net zero, and each targeting or involving a different part of the financial infrastructure. The Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance is an international group of over 40 institutional investors, many of them you'd know, mainly pension funds, insurance companies with long-term investment horizons and liabilities. Its members account for over 6.6 trillion of assets under management. The Net Zero Banking Alliance, so banks as opposed to insurance companies, has grown to 53 banks in 27 countries that have 37 trillion in total assets. This represents about a quarter of all banking assets worldwide. And the third is the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. A little bit of overlap with the asset owners, but Insurance Alliance members have committed to transition their insurance and reassurance underwriting portfolios to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, also consistent with the temperature goal of 1.5 degrees. So these three initiatives, each addresses a different part of the finance sector, have in common the use of science-based intermediate targets and rather strict reporting on their progress, both publicly and on an annual basis. At least some of them have also agreed to advocate for and engage in governmental policy changes for a science-based and socially just transition of economic sectors broadly to net zero. So it's not only oil and gas, but basically the financing of the let's say net zero economy. So next slide, if I could. The good news is movement, positive movement. Many of the world's largest economies and companies have established net zero targets. To date, these countries represent over 60% of global emissions. They're not all exactly the same commitments, but 60% of emissions are covered under some type of net zero target. Countries that have made a commitment represent 37% of global oil and gas production and about 64% of the world's oil and gas consumption. So getting close to 2/3 of consumption. The net zero targets are, of course, important, but they need to be based on the latest science and aligned, of course, with the Paris Agreement. Long-term commitments, and I think I'd really like to emphasize this point, and it goes back to something that I raised in the context of the emission gap report. Long-term commitments are not enough. Net zero goals will only be effective against the worst effects of climate change if they're accompanied by strong interim targets and action that can be verified. According to the Oxford Net Zero Initiative, only about 20% of existing net zero goals meet what you could call basic criteria of robustness, and only about 60% include interim targets. So failure to, let's say, to improve the commitments so that they match or are accompanied by concrete actions is worrisome. But of course, you have to start with a commitment before you can move on into the details of action. So that's something we're keeping an eye on. The next slide, if you would. I'd like to turn to one area where we see great potential for oil and gas companies, and that is in the area of methane mitigation. Clearly a win for near-term action in support of net zero goals. The short atmospheric lifetime of methane means that action today can have immediate positive effects and slow the pace of warming in the future. I think it's important, and anyone in the audience can help make that distinction clear to those with whom you are dealing. There's a big difference between short-lived climate forcers, short-lived climate pollutants, and carbon dioxide. The oil and gas industry is in a particularly interesting position because of carbon and methane. And we need you to take action on methane and explain that it's not one or the other, but really both. So going back to the projections and pathways, global methane emissions need to be reduced by about 40 to 45% by 2030 to be on track for reaching the Paris Agreement goals in a cost-effective manner. You can delay action and then have to spend more in a sense, but methane emissions of this magnitude would reduce climate warming by 0.3 degrees or so is the estimate by 2045. That's a significant number. We're into the realm where even 0.1 degrees, 0.2 degrees doesn't seem like much, but it really does matter in terms of the consequences. The fossil fuel sector is, of course, not only a major methane emitter, but has probably the greatest potential for cost-effective emissions reduction. And there are, of course, readily available measures that could reduce emissions from both the oil and gas sector and the coal sector by roughly 2/3. That's the average of the two sectors, but with most emissions able to be eliminated at low or even negative net cost. And these estimates come from the International Energy Agency. The conclusion there is that action on methane in the fossil fuel sector can rapidly provide the methane reduction necessary to slow the pace of global warming and climate change, while efforts continue to decarbonize the global energy system. The next slide, if you could. So direct methane mitigation from the oil and gas infrastructure in particular can double methane emissions reductions and triple the amount of warming avoided by mid-century relative to, let's say, indirect mitigation that comes from decarbonization only in the sector. So final slide, if you would. Things that we think we would like to see Ipieca oil and gas companies or members broadly either do or support. As I've stated a number of times, achieving net zero emissions is needed to meet the Paris Agreement goals. So this is easier now, I think, to make a commitment now that some oil and gas companies have done so. It's always hard to be first, but the path has been broken. And we would urge all oil and gas companies to at least begin the internal discussion about how to make a commitment and add the teeth to it that are necessary. So the second part of that is ambitious interim targets for reducing emissions in the near term, possibly a focus on methane, but not exclusively. These are necessary to establish and maintain credibility with the financial sector, political decision makers, and civil society broadly. Methane mitigation is an important opportunity for the oil and gas industry to reduce emissions in the near term. Again, almost 2/3 of emissions can be eliminated with technologies and practices that are available today. And that would provide up to about 15% of the emissions reductions needed required to meet the Paris goals. And these targets on methane or otherwise need to be backed by credible reporting and verification mechanisms. We have in UNEP put a lot of effort with partners, many of them on the call today, or on part of the event today, in something called the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. which provides a comprehensive measurement-based reporting framework that will be verified through something called the International Methane Emissions Observatory, so that there is credible documentation and credible evidence of the progress being achieved that can be provided to external stakeholders. But sadly, for me anyway, today over 2/3 of the Ipieca members have not yet joined the OGMP. So I would urge all those of you in the private sector to join the 70 or so companies that have signed up for this effort. It's a very good way to get started. So my final slide, I was off by one, but that concludes what I think is, or I hope certainly is, a big picture overview of where we are in terms of global emissions trajectories and some of the forces bringing about change. I hope it sets a good foundation for some of the more detailed presentations today. I thank you again for having me. It's always a pleasure. So thank you.
Mark, Jim Hoverton here. Thank you very much for such an excellent presentation to start us off. And with the next steps for the oil and gas sector very clearly spelled out on your final slide. And it's good to see action on methane and transparency on reporting as key steps and enablers as part of the journey to net zero, things that Ipieca has been working on for quite some time, and with the oil and gas sector will continue to work on. So I'd like now to introduce our first session, and our first session covers the perspectives of investors and stakeholders. We have 4 presenters and we hope a range of views. We'll let the speakers introduce themselves as we go along. And we'll run this session a little bit differently from the others. We have Nate Aiden of the World Resources Institute who'll start the session, and Anna Akanfora of the World Economic Forum will be the final presenter. Nate apologizes, but he has to leave after this presentation, so we've got you on first, Nate. So please put any questions in the chat box for Nate as he goes along, and we'll see if we can fit them in before he goes. And in the middle, we have a fireside chat between Patrick Pura of Allianz Investment Management and Dr. Rory Sullivan of the Transition Pathway Initiative. This fireside chat will be moderated by my colleague Ulrika Schopp. So over to you, Nate, to open the session.
Great. Thank you, Jim, and thank you to Ipieca for inviting me to present today. So the next slide just gives introduction to who I am. I'm with the World Resources Institute, as Jim mentioned, but I'm also part of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is a collaboration between WRI, CDP, UN Global Compact, and WWF. The next slide just shows the topics I'll be going through today very quickly due to lack of time here, but I'll just briefly talk about context for the oil and gas sector in a net zero world. Mark already mentioned some of this, and then I'll talk about some targets components that we're seeing in the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and then some ideas for potential roles for oil and gas companies beyond decarbonizing their energy systems. The next slide just gives 2 figures from that net zero report that Mark mentioned. So the first just shows the very rapid reductions for oil and gas production under the net zero scenario published in May by the IEA of 75% and 55% reduction of oil and gas. And then the figure on the right shows the increase in investment among these companies in low emissions technologies. You can see that the investment in conventional traditional operations is eclipsed by investment in new technologies within this decade. So it's a very rapid shift that we're seeing here from an investor perspective as well. The next slide just gives some summary of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So for those of you who haven't heard of it, it was launched in 2015, and now we have 1,600 companies and financial institutions, some of whom are on this call today, who have committed to setting science-based targets, of which 800 have targets that have met our criteria. So those are 5 to 15-year targets that are at least aligned with a well below 2-degree level of ambition. These tend to be large companies and financial institutions. They're about 1/5 of the global Fortune 500 so far. The next slide just gives a quick overview of our present work on developing a standard for net zero target setting. So the idea is that net zero has gotten well ahead of the accounting and the reality of emissions reductions for companies or other stakeholders. And so we take what we sometimes call a mitigation hierarchy approach, which is that the net zero entity, whether it's a company or a financial institution, needs to reduce its own scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions first. And then they can talk about netting once they've reduced their own emissions for any residual emissions. And so the standard that we're developing and publishing later this year specifies how this works for companies in the real economy. The next slide transitions to the target setting part of this. And from the Science Based Targets Initiative perspective, we have one former oil and gas company that has successfully gone through this transition and has a 1.5 degree target with us. When they came to us in 2015, they were called Danish Oil and Natural Gas, and everyone will know what they're called now. The next slide gives a summary of their present target, which is 1.5 degree aligned. Next slide, please. And you can see it's Ørsted, which is now a global offshore wind dominant company, and we've been pleased to be part of the vehicle for their low carbon transformation. Though of course they have their own programs and ways of doing things, but they've had a science-based target since early on. Of course, not all Ipieca members can do what Dong Energy did and become Ørsted. So the next slide is the most substantive of this presentation, and it's full of text, so you can read it later. But if you can go to the next slide, I can read through the key points. There are basically 10 points here for oil and gas company targets. And so I know this is overwhelming, so I'll just read through the 10 for you. So the first is just that it's a 5 to 10 year target, and that it's not just an intensity target. There are many oil and gas companies that are keen to have emissions intensity of their energy products, but an absolute target needs to accompany that intensity target for it to be credible and clearly linked with climate stabilization outcomes. The second is that it should use open source methods. And so OGCI has already been referenced here, but there are other open source methods that are available as well. The third is that, and this is particularly from an investor perspective, publicly reporting on the emissions associated with the reported fossil fuel reserves is a good practice. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has published a way of doing this calculation, and this can help financial institutions to assess their stranded asset risk. So we recommend this as best practice. The fourth here is using additional intensity targets for product categories by function, so moving beyond energy to feedstocks. For those of you who follow the IEA closely, their Future of Petrochemicals report from a few years ago showed that actually the biggest demand growth for oil and gas is for chemical feedstocks as opposed to energy products in the future. And so actually tracking this as opposed to ignoring it in target formulations is essential. Many oil and gas companies are very keen to invest in nature-based solutions. That's great, but that can, apologies for the noise here, that can't be a distraction or a substitution for mitigating their own emissions. So any NBS investments should be reported separately from the company's GHG mitigation strategy, not a substitute for that. Feedstock category GHG intensity targets for both the energy and chemical businesses. This links with the earlier point on product categories by function there. And then GHG intensity of primary energy use as opposed to sold product is useful here to get a bigger picture. Mark mentioned methane targets, and of course we fully agree. There are a few sort of related initiatives. Mark mentioned some of them as well. I think, again, pairing absolute and intensity targets for methane reductions are essential for credibility and robustness of target setting here. And then on the sort of green side, documenting the low carbon R&D, CapEx, and acquisitions is a useful thing to start doing to just mark the energy transition of these oil and gas companies and show leadership. And finally, policy advocacy leadership is important, and there are some industry groups that are proactive here, and there are some that are clearly part of the problem. and so starting to differentiate between those groups in terms of membership and affiliation is important for moving this discussion forward. The next slide just transitions to my final topic here, which is potential roles for oil and gas companies beyond just decarbonization and decarbonization targets. So this one's relatively simple. It's not going to kill you with text as the last one. So the next slide just shows 3 ideas here. The first is developing a responsible divestment protocol for permanent decommissioning and transformation of obsolete facilities. So there are numerous large companies that are divesting from various assets nowadays. Dirty refineries on the west coast of the US, for example, and just divesting from those is certainly not sufficient to support net zero transformation, and it is not a legitimate or functional way of achieving net zero. What we need is permanent decommissioning or transformation of these facilities. And just, by the way, from a GHG accounting perspective, if an oil or gas company divests these assets, those are no longer part of the baseline. So it's not like you've suddenly achieved some miraculous emissions reduction. So that's the first and I think most important potential role here. A second one is investment and scaling of direct air capture with long-term storage. There are some oil and gas companies that are already active in this space. And then finally, helping to reduce demand for oil and gas. If we move into a world of $100 or $200 per barrel oil, that's not good for any of us. It's going to cause additional destabilization, exacerbate inequality. What we need is a stable transition, and oil and gas companies are the ones who are best positioned to help with this transition to electricity and hydrogen, to reduce oil and gas demand to smooth this transition. So these are 3 roles for oil and gas companies that do want to be part of the solution here. And that's my last slide. The next slide is my last slide. So I'm happy to pause for a couple minutes to answer any questions or discuss, or you can reach me through these affiliations listed on this slide.
Thank you, Nate. That's excellent. I know you have to jump. If I could, I think we're having some issues with the chat box, so people will need to raise their hand to ask a question. I just wanted to ask you, with your SBTI, with your science-based targets hat on, when's the oil and gas methodology coming out? Because we've had a long-standing relationship with CDP and Science-Based Targets Initiative as Ipieca. We had a webinar, I think, in the early days of the methodology. So we offer that kind of invitation. And certainly the 3 ideas that you've got there are certainly worthy of a longer discussion in themselves. But looking forward to the methodology, open offer of a webinar, and open offer to pick up on those 3 themes that you highlighted in your last slide. So I'm just looking around to see if there are any questions from participants.
Yeah, sure. I can just answer you briefly, yeah. Jim. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think those components that I listed on my 8th slide with the 10 suggested components are some hints as to sort of the discussion that's ongoing around the oil and gas method being developed by the initiative. So I hope that we will have something published later this year, but it remains to be seen. And of course, the sort of broader policy context is influencing the conversation as well, with legal outcomes in May.
Thanks a lot, Nate. Ulrika, Jack, I'm not seeing any hands up, but I know we're having technical issues.
No, me not either.
Okay, so on that basis, Nate, again, thank you for your excellent presentation, and we will pick up with you offline if that's okay, to continue the dialogue and give more time for a discussion on the points that you raise. And then I'll
excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Nate. Next slide. And now, Ulrika, if I hand over to you as the moderator of a fireside chat, and given that it was kind of storms and floods yesterday in London, the sun has come out, so I'll take that as a positive sign for your fireside chat. So take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think with the temperatures today, even in the UK, we should be fine to not open up a fire here. Yeah, I see Patrick and Rory are already on the line and have their videos on, which is great. And yeah, I think we will dive right into it. So we have the session prepared today on how do investors expect the oil and gas sector to respond to climate change. And I'll just give a quick intro on our two speakers before handing them over to the two of them. So we have Dr. Rory Sullivan, co-founder and director of Kronos Sustainability. Rory is an internationally recognized expert on climate change, human rights, and investment, and he has almost 30 years experience in the public and private sectors. Rory holds various positions, one of them being Chief Technical Advisor for the Transition Pathway Initiative. And we have Patrick Purra. Patrick manages the ESG engagement program for the Allianz, and besides other responsibilities, he is co-leading the United Nations convened Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance activities. And I'm sure we will learn a lot more about these two initiatives we have just mentioned. But please, for now, Rory and Patrick, I'll give the stage to you to say a few words about yourself and your organizations. And then afterwards, I'm going to shoot some questions. So, Rory, are you happy to go first?
Yes, thank you, Ulrika. So just, I mean, I think you've done my introduction, but just to explain that the Transition Pathway Initiative is an asset owner-led initiative, which evaluates companies, the largest emitting companies in the world, on two aspects: on their management of greenhouse gases and on their carbon performance. The TPI has developed and has discussed extensively with the industry a methodology for assessing net zero in the oil and gas sector, and that standard is due to be published in the next month or so. And TPI is also the information provider to the Climate Action 100 Plus initiative.
Okay, thank you, Rory, and over to you, Patrick.
Great, yeah, thank you to both of you for the invite to this chat, and it's great to be speaking with some of the former colleagues from my former sector. So why do I say that? So my professional background is actually in oil and gas. So I worked for almost 8 years at Chevron Canada on the west coast of Canada near Vancouver, where it's a fully integrated oil and gas company. So it was everything from upstream operations down to refining and marketing. Through a strange turn of events, I've ended up in Munich, Germany, where I work for Allianz, which is the world's largest insurer and one of the world's largest asset owners, which means we have about an 800 billion euro portfolio. And as Ulrika mentioned, I manage our engagement commitments at Allianz. So that's talking to both companies and asset managers to ensure that asset managers align their stewardship and investment activities with the long-term expectations for a climate-concerned asset owner like ourselves.
Great, thanks a lot, Patrick. So starting with you, as you've mentioned, you're working for Allianz in Germany, and probably Allianz is mostly known by everyone for its insurance business. But can you just give us a bit more insight of how this insurance business and climate change go together? So what's in for the Allianz in that?
Great. Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of people ask, where do our climate commitments come from and why do we care so much? And is it just because it's a strategic advantage to appeal to customers? And the answer is very clearly no. It's a strategic necessity for us to manage our investment money in line with 1.5 in order to abate climate change, because an unabated climate change world doesn't have room for the current insurance market share that currently exists. So as the world becomes more unpredictable, as the world starts to see more catastrophic events, our insurance business is at risk of continuing the way it is. And so to address this, we use our investment money and we commit to things like the UN Asset Owner Alliance in order to induce real world change. And we're doing this to partner up with other asset owners, like Mark made in his introduction. There's over $6.5 trillion of asset owners now committed to this. And it's because we recognize that we have to see systemic change to current policy frameworks. So just a company by company dialogue, which I often do, isn't sufficient to align the world with 1.5, which is why we banded together. Even though Allianz is quite large, we're not large enough to send the policy message necessary. And that's why we've banded together to make the Asset Owner Alliance.
Thank you, Patrick. Can you give us a bit more insight about the UN Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, just to have a bit more understanding about what you're trying to achieve with it and who else is engaged in it?
Yeah, so it's 42 asset owners now. Mark opened with his introductions around it being some of the largest insurance companies as well as pension funds. And the key message is we're looking for the real world change. This is not a portfolio cleansing exercise where we're looking after our financial risks. We're looking after the real economy risks to our core business from the insurance side and to pensioners from the pension side. And so because we want to see this 1.5 degree alignment in our portfolios, which is a reflection of the global economy, we've come together to set interim targets. So it's not just net zero by 2050, it's every 5 years we have targets to hit in decarbonization in line with 1.5.
Thank you, Patrick. So Rory, coming to you. So we have heard a lot of from Patrick about the existential risks to be managed by insurances, but what is really the investment case for action? Could you enlighten us on that?
Of course. Thank you, Ulrika. And I guess given that we mentioned biblical weather, let me start by saying I'm now going to give you the catastrophic doomsayer investor perspective on climate change in the oil and gas sector. Fundamentally, this sector faces three challenges, and the bad news is everybody knows them. So you can't pretend any longer. The first is that the fundamental business case around oil and gas has changed. The economics of renewables and bioenergy versus oil has changed. The fact that we can now store energy sort of gets rid of one of the big selling points of the oil and gas sector, which are their effectively energy stores, which are readily accessible. And also some of the get out of jail free cards that the industry has touted, for example, the ability to divert oil and gas products to plastics, are also being challenged by growing awareness of the ecological and environmental impacts of plastics. So what we are seeing, I think the energy sector's narrative has been one of growth demand in the world and how that's fantastic. But I think the narrative investors are seeing is, yes, you might have demand and growth for energy. It's not clear what the energy mix will look like, and it's not clear how significant oil and gas will be in that. So that's bad news number one. It gets worse. For those of you who are saying, yeah, we know all that. Okay, the second is government action. Now, I understand, of course, that governments flip and flop and change their minds, and the dependability of public policies is a recurring question. The reality, however, is that there's a clear direction of travel. We're seeing tightening regulation. And even in those countries whom a year or two ago we might have said are never going to act on climate change, like the United States, are now starting to act. So I think, and remembering that this is not about saying governments will phase or eliminate the oil and gas sector tomorrow, but what's happening is it's nibbling away at your ability to grow, and it's nibbling away at your margins. And this is not a sector that can basically deal with much nibbling away of growth or of margins. So the second bad bit of news is that the level of government action, it is not the big bang kind of government intervention. It's the multitude of little policy measures and interventions that are altering the economics of this sector. And investors know all about that. The third and the really, really, really bad bit of news, for those of you who think, oh, well, we can deal with those first 2 points, is that it's increasingly difficult for investors to hold the oil and gas sector. The pressure from stakeholders, the kind of arguments Patrick advanced about the insurability of risk, mean that investors are in portfolio investors, the institutions you want on your shareholder registers, are increasingly unwilling to hold oil and gas. Now, I realize that some of you listening will say, yeah, we can just sit in the private and we can just generate revenues. We don't have to worry about it. Nice idea. What happens when you need to access capital? What happens when you want an exit strategy? Where do you go if you're not going to go to the public markets? And where do you go when what is now interesting is the Deny the Debt campaign, which has just started gaining traction, also means that the private markets, the kind of places where you can hide if the public markets won't touch you, are increasingly constrained in terms of what they will hold and what they will invest in. So I would say there's a triple whammy of biblical scale catastrophes, bad news coming straight at this sector, and I think I think this means that this is no longer an existential risk. It's a clear and present danger, to quote Tom Clancy. Thank you.
Thanks, Rory. I think that was a very clear message to all participants, and yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion later on already. Building onto that, so what do you think is the solution for that? So what do you think the industry needs to do now?
Okay, I'll start, Patrick, if I may. So I think the types of strategic responses that the industry can make are actually reasonably clear, are starting to take shape. You know, it is a question around shifting from oil and gas production, perhaps maybe moving to gas in the first instance, building renewables and bioenergy businesses, looking for alternative pathways for products, harnessing the core skills the industry has, like large scale project development in other areas. And some of the ideas Nate presented on his last slide also speak to the role of the industry. So I think there is a pathway for the industry. We have seen a number of companies, I think Shell and BP are probably the exemplars, setting out strategies that seek to respond to this. But my fourth bit of biblical bad news, and this is the one that I would be really concerned about if I was the industry. The first three are well understood and well known. The fourth is that I am not convinced the industry is going to get the right to dictate its own future. The industry's response, I think, to the pressures coming from the Asset Owner Alliance and Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance and TPI and others has essentially been one of denial. There have been one or two companies who have engaged. Most have tried to pretend it's not happening. And I think we're looking at an industry which, rather than setting the terms of the debate, is going to get what SBTI just presented, which is a wish list that the industry has to accept. And I think as a strategic perspective on this industry, yes, there are structural challenges and we know all them, but I think the industry is no longer it's certainly not positioning itself to be the master of its own fate. It is going to allow others to make the running and dictate what it needs to do. There is one sector which has actually dealt with this kind of existential threat some 15 or 20 years ago, which is the mining sector, with its Mining, Minerals and Sustainable Development Initiative, where it worked with stakeholders, say, what does the future look like on a range of, it was dealing with issues like conflicts, human rights, etc., and let's define a common vision for the industry that we then have a collective response to. We identify the problem, we agree the types of solutions we can adopt, and we work together to address. But I don't see that emerging from this sector. And I think what's going to happen is individual companies are getting picked off, and the sector as a whole is going to get massively beaten up by stakeholders who frankly don't care about you. That's your reality, unless you, the industry, sort of, I was going to say man up, but I can't say that anymore, person up and start engaging with this in a much more thoughtful, constructive and long-term way.
Thank you, Rory. I'm really glad that we'll have later on a session around industry response and what we are doing. So I think we have seen, especially over the last 2 years, a lot of engagement by companies around the topic of net zero emissions. I think just looking at Ipieca members, we have meanwhile 24 companies having some kind of net zero aspirations. So there is movement, and there is also the own expectations to do something. So I'm really hoping you can stay on the line and also listen later on to the industry view. Coming now back to Patrick. So if companies are saying that they have a net zero target in line with society, what do you expect them to do to make this really a reality?
Yeah, great question, Ipieca, and perhaps it's worth adding on to Rory's statements before perhaps less in a challenging manner, but more in an explanatory manner. So we talked about public markets and targets in the public markets, but to be clear, asset owners are involved in many asset classes, including private asset classes. And the targets that we're setting for ourselves includes our lending, our private debt, our private equity. So it's very clear that the initiatives across the financial industry are targeting all sources of funding and all sources of investment. So it's clear that they're moving in tandem, and at the same time, we need policy to be moving in tandem, because going after supply alone, of course, is detrimental. You have to have policy reducing demand in tandem, or perhaps a little bit in advance of supply destructing. So just to add on to that. Now, to your question around what do we expect from oil and gas companies that have made a net zero commitment? So first, scope 1 and 2 emissions have to be on an absolute basis, and they have to be targets. So we want to see short, medium, and long-term targets, which could be clearly reported and then clearly integrated into our portfolio steering activities. Now, when it comes to scope 3 ambitions, a lot of oil and gas companies are making them in line with society, so to speak. And therefore, there's much more sensitivity around how should we interpret something that's in line with society. And what cannot happen is for a commitment to be in line with society and then lobbying activities pushing society in a way that's not 1.5 degree aligned. And this is where investors are using the Climate Action 100 benchmark to really judge companies to see if all of their statements and supposed actions are happening in sync with each other. So what does this mean? It means that this is an organizational change and behavior journey that oil and gas companies need to be going through. If you're making statements and ambitions of scope 3 in line with society, at the same time, you need to be analyzing all of the associations you're part in. You need to be engaging those associations if they're not in turn representing your commitments to 1.5 or to net zero. And you need to be working internally to make sure that across your global companies, that people are giving the same message to policymakers worldwide.
Thanks, Patrick. And that leads me to my next question. So we have heard about Climate Action 100. And yeah, I would like to learn a bit more about where do you see investors sitting in all of these ambitions around net zero emissions, and especially also for Rory to respond to, maybe to give a bit more insight on the role of initiatives like the Transition Pathway Initiative. So really, where do you see your role, and how can you help, in this case, the oil and gas sector to drive ambitions here?
Thank you, Ulrika. I see the investment industry, and actually, I would probably see the finance sector as a whole. So I include investment banking and insurance as being potentially one of the industry's strongest and most important allies. I mean, clearly, despite my earlier comments, we recognise that we need a healthy and functioning energy sector, and within that, we need oil and gas. I mean, even the most demanding expectations on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from sectors see oil and gas being an integral part of the energy mix for many years to come. So that's the starting point. I think investors can be a strong supporter of the industry. You know, however, I think there's the challenge which mirrors Patrick's last set of comments, which is the industry needs to be serious about its commitments and to engage substantively with the debate around net zero. I think what we have seen is investors being willing to be supportive of companies. I think the initiatives like the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance and others provide a framework within which investors can express that support. But I think they are looking to the industry to similarly take this issue seriously. In saying all of that, I would also say that investors probably have not been the most consistent of stakeholders in this debate. And I think you know, looking at me and Patrick, I think when companies make strong and brave commitments, and I'm looking at companies like Shell and BP, I think it's also incumbent on investors to lend their support to that, to provide them with the kind of institutional support they need to actually turn those commitments into reality. So I think there is a need for a very grown-up discussion between investors and companies. I think the leading investors are looking to companies to make serious commitments, but I think when companies make those commitments and demonstrate that they're implementing them, then I think investors need to be brave enough to stand alongside companies. And again, this is where I think the idea of a sort of a shared ownership of the net zero transition is so important. Investors are important to this sector, not just because of their financial contribution, but because of their ability to support the sector politically. But again, I think the sector needs to play a much cleverer, much more engaged, or have a much cleverer and more engaged strategy to make that a reality.
Thanks, Rory. That was really a more encouraging perspective. I think we haven't lost participants on the meeting, so that's great. So Patrick, now we have heard from Rory that the finance sector are the allies of the oil and gas sector. So that's already great and a great basis for a relationship here. Do you think it's realistic to expect from the industry to act on its own, or should they really rely on support from investors? And I will add on that, I'm pretty sure the industry will have very clear views on this, that they are of course able to do this and are doing it already, as we will learn later on. But I'm really interested to get your thoughts and expectations on that, how to really reach these ambitions.
Sure. Yeah. So maybe on scope 1 and 2, there's a lot more room for them to work on their own. But when it comes to the economics that drive scope 3, absolutely not is it a place where just oil and gas companies' voluntary commitments, especially when it's just a handful of voluntary commitments coming from public entities, which is about 15% of world supply. Absolutely not is that enough. So we need to be working as sectors. We need to be working as value chains. Investors are there to help convene and participate in that. And we have to stop, as investors, perpetuating the idea that voluntary commitments coming from corporate engagements is going to save the day. It takes the bullseye off of the real big problem, which is policy frameworks have incentivized the use of fossil fuels because, of course, they have so many wonderful properties, but we're not paying for the externalities that they also have, which is perhaps another one of the properties that have saved us in the past, and it's allowed for this amazing revolution and increase in human wellness, but it's now an extreme problem going forward. So without a doubt, it's not a thing that we expect oil and gas to deal with on their own, but we want to see the transparency. We want to see the commitments. And when it comes to transparency, that includes stress testing your financial statements in line with 1.5 degree scenarios. So if the IEA says that a 1.5 scenario and the demand destruction that comes with it will lead to $30 per barrel, we need to see what's the implications of that on financial statements and your impairment write-downs, so that we could understand what kind of risks are we facing here and allocate our portfolios respectively.
Thanks, Patrick. I think that was really an appreciated call for action for everyone. So to the both of you, where do we need to go from here? So how can we all together make it happen if it's not the industry going alone or just the investors? So really hand in hand as allies, how can we make it happen? Rory, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you, Luke. So I think the starting point is that the low carbon transition is a shared responsibility. I think that's the starting point for all of this. For all the reasons Patrick outlined, no one actor or sector can do this on its own. Where I think we've seen some very interesting developments is the work that the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change with the Asset Owner Alliance and others have done on working out what sectoral transition looks like. So it involves bringing different actors together. So we've looked at oil and gas, which has had oil and gas companies, battery manufacturers, vehicle manufacturers, etc., financiers and policymakers saying, what are the things we collectively need to do to enable the transition to happen? And this sort of mirrors the point I made earlier about how I think the industry needs to possibly change its attitude to low carbon transition and to understand as a collective problem as much as an individual corporate strategy problem. So I think the answer is bringing those actors together, agreeing what the transition might look like, the roles and responsibilities of different actors, and then working together. I would also say I'm not naive. I mean, this is very, very difficult, and I fully understand the challenges and the rigidities and the barriers to change amongst investors, as you know, my community as much as amongst the oil and gas sector and amongst policy. But I think I'm also very aware that this sector is going to get steamrollered unless it's careful. And I think while what Patrick and I have talked about is going to the limits of what even the leading companies do, that is where the debate is now positioned. So we are both deliberately challenging you, not because we want to cause trouble. Well, Patrick loves causing trouble, but I much prefer having friends everywhere. But I think there's actually a very serious point underpinning it, which is that this sector's time to respond is running out very quickly. I think there are vehicles. I think the role of the investment community is very interesting. I think the potential for sort of collective action. I think the work of the IIGCC Paris Aligned Investing Initiative and the Net Zero Investment Framework provide opportunities for this sector to be engaged and to at least manage the transition at a rate that allows it and the companies within the sector to adapt. But I think to summarize, it's a shared responsibility for the sector. And I think the industry needs to understand that individual company action not just is not going to be sufficient, but actually fragments what needs to be a sectoral response.
Thanks, Rory. And just to make that very clear, I mean, we have invited you to challenge us. So that was the expectation. And I'm glad you're doing it and giving us your honest views on that. Patrick, do you have anything to add to what Rory just said?
Yeah, so when it comes to getting serious about strategies, I think a lot of companies, particularly North American companies, need to be more clear about what they're doing. So from my analysis and how I'm looking at it, it seems like there's sort of 4 strategies that are being played out by Western publicly listed oil and gas companies. There's the run down your business. So scale down, return cash to shareholder. There's the reinvent your company. So become an energy company. You're no longer an oil company, and invest in all kinds of new technologies. So that's strategy 1 and 2. Strategy 3, I think what we're seeing is maintain flexibility, shorten your project cycles, move away from kind of the giga projects and major offshore platforms, and see how things play out. And then there's the 4th, which is kind of let's go all in. If the world cuts supply but demand doesn't go, there's going to be massive rewards for us. It's very clear on strategy 4 that those are the type of companies that, as an asset owner, we're asking our asset managers to escalate stewardship. So we want to see boards voted against for that. At the same time as we want our asset managers signaling to policy that the world that they're hoping will kind of continue and they'll reap rewards won't happen. And that's the whole reason why we have the Asset Owner Alliance. But what's really tricky is this 3rd strategy, where it's kind of scale back, maintain flexibility, be ready to go to one side or the other. And investors have to decide, when do we take those companies and classify them into strategy 1 or 2? Or when do they kind of get to the point where it's too late? You're now classified into strategy 4, and you're also banking on the world not meeting its targets. And that's what's very tricky. And the best way to avoid that is to look at the indicators in the CA100 benchmark, align your business strategies and be transparent with it. Push for a tougher playing field, so a more decarbonized world, and then compete relative to your peers and outcompete relative to your peers on better carbon performance. And so it doesn't mean you're going to be less competitive if the industry is more heavily regulated and the world moves to 1.5. For those that are pushing the strategy 1, 2, and currently in 3, but could hopefully move to 1 or 2, you'll be rewarded if you're the best competitor on a tighter playing field. And that's what we want to see.
Thank you so much, both. And I think as we are kind of short on time now, these were really great final remarks to give our participants here on the way. So I think we really got a very clear call for action from you both, and unfortunately we have already reached the end of our time contract. So it's just up to me now to say thanks a lot for your time and for your honesty in this chat. I mean, you're probably in the minority when I look at the participant list here. But yeah, I'm really looking forward also if you would like to stay on the line and really give us also in continuing of this session, your challenge and your response to what we are doing as an industry and how we are responding to these challenges we all have together. So thanks a lot, and I'm handing back to Jim to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you very much, Ulrika and Rory and Patrick. I think there were some firecrackers in that fireside chat, and the better for it. So and to round off this session, I'd like to introduce Anna Akamfora of the World Economic Forum. So please, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to share the experience that the World Economic Forum is doing here around the decarbonization effort and the path to net zero, and in particular to the effort that we're doing with our community to accelerate this net zero transition in urban environment. We all know that cities, are places that host over half of the global population, are accountable for over 70% of CO2 emissions, and I would say the vast majority of primary energy demand, approximately 80%, is actually consumed in cities. So we decided to develop a program that it's focusing on the demand centers, on the demand side, knowing that the energy transition that needs to take place needs to address not only the supply structure but also the demand side. The World Economic Forum a year and a half ago pretty much launched what the Net Zero Carbon Cities Initiative, which is a program that involves over 70 organizations from public and private stakeholders across 10 different industries. And this is where, of course, also oil and gas companies are involved into this program, because as we heard from previous speaker, the decarbonization is not only on one specific stakeholders, but we do have to understand how to make it a collective effort, and how different companies and different organizations have to transition, potentially change their business models, and find a new way to be profitable, still sustainable, and deliver value for the people and the planet. So our Net Zero Carbon Cities community has been working for now a year, and basically recommends to really work on an integrated approach to transform a urban ecosystem. What does it mean, integrated approach, and what needs to be transformed within the specific urban environment? So starting from the latter, what we need to transform and what we need to make sure that becomes net zero. First of all, our buildings, places where we live, and our homes. Secondly, transport, facilitate a transformation of the transport system in cities. Energy infrastructure, in particular, making sure that the energy infrastructure are reliable, are as clean and as electrified as possible. And last but not least, work on the water and waste management system. How do we want to do that? We want to do that, first of all, by crowdsourcing and curating a lot of one-off solutions that have been developed worldwide, because we do know that there are some champions in different industry and in different parts of the world that do implement good solution and good business cases, ranging from solution in Northern Europe that really tackle eating problems or other retrofitting and decarbonizing programs all over Europe to really tackle the built living environment. We want to collect all this experience from different players and make sure that this can be available for many other players. The role of oil and gas companies in this respect is fundamental, especially when it comes to drive the transition of the mobility system and transport, as well as to address the transformation that needs to take place at retail level, and so define together how to move and change the behavior of citizens and consumers when it comes to energy habits. Something that we think it's important to remind and to remind our community members and what we are recommending is that our challenge here is the scale and the pace. So we do have to accelerate this transformation, and we identified 3 key elements for which all stakeholders should be aligned and advocate for. The first one should be integrated policy, and we heard before that policy is something that definitely can drive an aligned effort of different stakeholders. So it's fundamental that we understand how the energy system needs to change, also on demand side, and especially in urban environment. The second thing that is important is understand the potential of the district level projects, because when a city or more than a city, when a set of urban stakeholders decide to go for a district level project, there we can see the combination and the collaboration of different stakeholders that may combine their different business models. They can test solutions, and then they can eventually adapt and scale to the wider cities to solution. We think that this model is very successful, and we do have several stakeholders that have been working together in Singapore, in Stockholm, in the US, and we think that this is an experience that needs to be scaled. Last but not least, and this is something that also was touched upon before, all these stakeholders are accountable to make their part in sharing information, be transparent about what they do, and make sure that they do count on public engagement, and we all be part of the cultural shift that is needed in order to accelerate this transformation. When energy companies, including oil and gas, will change their business model, will eventually change their product offering in their and also their tariff system, they need to rely on a change of consumers and behaviors. And so this is the reason why it's important that across the entire value chain and across the entire energy system, we do understand what needs to change, not only from technical and structural point of view, but also from cultures and behaviors, and act accordingly, because this is what actually will trigger the execution and will support the scale up of this change. After, to be very quick, since I see we're running a little bit over.
Anna, that's perfect. So thank you very much. Sorry for bringing in kind of some new ideas. I think the concept of scale is something the oil and gas sector understands, but also your kind of thoughts around consumers, cultures and behaviours is something that's kind of a bit more remote, but certainly very, very important. So thank you all. As we've appreciated, we're running a little bit behind schedule, so I plan to move on to the second session, if that's okay. And we'll pick up any questions that come up in the chat as we go along and try and bring those in at the end. So our second session covers regional perspectives. And we all understand that the energy transition is underway and energy systems and services are being transformed as we speak. But the nature, the scale and the pace of the transition will look different depending on a variety of factors, the nature of a business, the starting points of the oil and gas company, and the developmental needs of individual countries. And there's no one answer, no one scenario or roadmap to a net zero future. And in this session, we have Glada Lan of Chatham House to discuss the challenges to be faced for resource-rich hydrocarbon producer nations. And Glada will be followed by Dr. R.K. Malhotra of FIPI, the Federation of Indian Petroleum Industry, and Anibal Kraga of ARDA, the African Refining and Distribution Association. And they will look at the challenges faced by an emerging country, India, and by an emerging continent, Africa. And Sustainable Development Goal 7 on access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy by 2030 is of paramount importance. And it's also a challenge that it should not be overlooked. So with that introduction, I'll say over to you, Glada.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, okay. Well, I want to talk a little bit first so that maybe to bring us on the same page in terms of how the value proposition has changed for extractives, for especially oil and gas in development. And some of these themes have already been touched on, but from the point of view of investors and companies. So if you turn to the first slide, please. Second one. And so from a development perspective, oil and gas can offer a number of benefits, chiefly in bringing in revenues, particularly foreign exchange, allowing for wealth fund creation for future generations. It can offer economic and energy linkages, especially in terms of the use of the products domestically to grow industry. And it can improve positioning for finance, so in terms of improving creditworthiness and lowering the cost of debt and encouraging FDI. And I mention these because along with those opportunities, there are a number of well-known risks, such as overheating the economy, decreasing competitiveness of other sectors, encouraging the centralization of power in an economy, and therefore sort of an allocative practices by the government that maybe disincentivize efficiency, rent-seeking, which might crowd out entrepreneurship and lead to an unequal wealth distribution, and of course the boom-bust pattern that you tend to see in many of the oil-rich economies, whereby pro-cyclical spending ends up leading to indebtedness, and in some countries even before production begins, in those countries that only have a relatively small production compared to their population size. So bearing those things in mind, how is decarbonization and some of the trends that have been discussed, how is that affecting considerations for oil and gas in development? Well, in short, there's three things that we can point to. There's growing uncertainty over national revenue and also the investment, for the reasons that Rory mentioned, over time. There's the risk of depletion, what I would call depletion-led development, so the heavy use of fuel in the domestic sector to create jobs and markets, so that the risk of that leading to lock-in of a very high carbon system and rising fuel demand, as opposed to the green alternatives that are available, or the lower cost alternatives that might be available and coming onto the market. And that's also tied to the kind of political economy that an oil and gas based development tends to lead a country down. So the rent-seeking practices, the allocative practices, might actually inhibit the transition to a low-carbon economy, for example. And then finally, the rapidly closing window for economic diversification. I mean, economic diversification is always seen as the holy grail, the kind of the ambition for heavily dependent countries, and it's now become very clear that the time frame for making that transition has got a lot shorter. Next slide, please. So in terms of that economic calculation, you know, for new producers in particular, the process looks familiar, but the context has changed. If we consider the waves of industrial innovation that have taken place over the last century, you can see that it probably made sense for Trinidad and Tobago, the Gulf countries in the 70s and 80s to develop a very carbon intensive heavy industry and add value to their products at home. But there's a real question over whether that makes sense in today's era of what we might call post-Paris wave of industrialization, which would include clean technologies, circular economy practices, AI and biomimicry, for example, sustainable agriculture. So the markets for commodities and commodity value are changing, and also the opportunities to diversify and create jobs are changing. And then on top of that, you've got the impacts of climate change themselves, and many heavily dependent producers are also extremely exposed to the impacts of climate change, which are putting pressure on fertile land, on biodiversity, land and sea, and other ecosystem services, fresh water, for instance, in particular. And so that's changing the calculation in terms of social goods, and especially in terms of the trade-offs of what oil and gas expansion might entail. So if we turn to the next slide. So how do we look, how can we think about vulnerability and exposure to carbon risk? There's different ways to look at this. This is a diagram that I've just borrowed from Carbon Tracker, who came out with a report on petrostates in January. And this looks at the potential revenue shortfall in a scenario of sort of average prices of $40 a barrel, as against the dependence of government revenue on oil and gas revenues. So up there you can see, I'm going to concentrate on the Middle East and North Africa area, so I've just labelled some of those countries as well as the ones that were labelled already, and show some of the high level of vulnerability there. But of course there's other factors to include as well. This is just one way of seeing it. You could look at the wealth cushions that various countries have got, the UAE, Saudi, Qatar, Kuwait. They all have invested heavily abroad, maybe in bonds, maybe in assets and other investments to try and create a cushion. And then there's the capacity to diversify in terms of governance and knowledge and innovation. There's the carbon intensity of the oil itself, given that might entail a premium in future, and the existing level of stability in a country. You see, I would probably put Iraq in the more vulnerable spot, for example, given that it's just come out of well, it's sort of coming out of conflict, but still very vulnerable. Yemen is not mentioned on there because of lack of data, but it would definitely be near at the top there. And then there's the political will, so the vision and the ability to sort of forge a path beyond dependence, which becomes incredibly important, especially in the state-heavy countries, the very centralized countries. So next slide, please. So there are different types of, different types of producers face different choices. I've put pictures of various Middle Eastern countries here just to illustrate that a little bit. There are countries with very high economic dependence on oil and gas revenues that have low cost oil, like Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and Iran with very large reserves. There's established producers that are facing decline in their oil production, like Algeria, Oman, Bahrain, and they really need to be looking at industrial reorientation at quite a rapid speed. And then you've got prospective producers, which include Lebanon in terms of the MENA region, which is expecting a discovery, hoping for a gas discovery. and they may have lower capacity, but they are built, in Lebanon's case, it's developing an oil and gas industry in readiness. So there are different contexts that these risks play into. And in the MENA region generally, I mean, several of the countries that we've mentioned, they're mature producers, they've grown up on oil and gas wealth, and they have an infrastructure very strongly geared towards using and producing more fuel. And they're also on the front line of climate impacts, given the aridity and some coastal exposure as well in the Gulf states, where there's quite heavily built up areas along the coastline, including the industry itself. So transition poses a new configuration of an oil question for them, which is that of transforming an economy to increase efficiencies and reduce dependence on this sector that's become so central to their economy. And it's not really new. I mean, MENA producers have been thinking about this for a long time. Saudi, UAE, Qatar are highly aware of the issues, and they're pursuing various visions for transformation, like Saudi's Vision 2030, for example. And then there's diversity amongst those countries, and as I've mentioned, some of the countries in the MENA region are mired in conflict, including Iraq, Yemen, Libya, and that really affects their ability to deal with volatility in the market, never mind long-term decline of revenues, and they rely on those revenues for an element of security too. And then you have questions over whether a country like Lebanon should choose to go in that direction at all, given the investment challenges. So what I would say about challenges, I mean, these countries are still reeling from the 2014 price fall, and then they've been hit by COVID, and it's something, it gives something of a reality check, when you see what's happened to the non-oil economy in the Gulf countries, that what we call a non-hydrocarbon economy is actually highly dependent on oil and gas revenues, and that's why you see big fluctuations in GDP, for instance. And it's become really clear that it's impossible to continue with the same model of state capitalism, and trying to open up to international investment while expecting the domestic, the private sector to take on a much greater burden of, say, providing jobs and providing taxes and delivering the revenues to make up, from declines in the oil wealth. So, yeah, I mean, I guess with regard to the oil and gas sector specifically, there's a desire to keep that sector going for as long as possible, especially for Saudi Arabia and perhaps for the UAE. Like, there's a bit of a difference. UAE wants to take advantage of a closing window for its slightly higher cost oil and gas. So hence there's some tension between the two within OPEC. People sometimes talk about the future being low cost and low carbon oil, and that's something that the Gulf producers in particular are betting on. There's numerous plans to develop blue and green hydrogen, the carbon capture usage and storage technology within industries, to use more solar in the sector. But it's important to bear in mind the price that's needed as well. Saudi oil is perhaps about $10 a barrel to produce similar. I think it's similar in Iraq, Algeria, but Saudi needs about $80 a barrel to balance the budget. Algeria, I think, needs about $135 a barrel. So, the situation, as in, that there might be much more sensitivity amongst those populations to smaller drops in welfare benefits. So that's something to bear in mind. In terms of new approaches, next slide, please. In terms of new approaches, as you mentioned already, there's no one size fits all. I wrote a paper with that title, the curse of the one size fits all, I think, with Paul Stevens a few years ago. Yeah, there's no one size fits all in terms of how to address the challenges and the risks that are posed by transition, but in terms of the broad brush, and how we can look at it in a broad brush way from a country level, a country that's highly dependent on oil revenue it faces many of the problems that have just been discussed in the previous session for companies, but it's much more exposed than a company because it can't just shift its assets, it can't just scale down its operations all of a sudden. Its shareholders are essentially the citizens. So there's got to be a society-wide vision with a strong pathway for transition, and that'll involve redirection of incentives. Often in these countries, basic energy, water, food commodities even are highly subsidized still, although there's been reform attempts in the last few years. But there need to be a strong redirection of incentives to encourage investment in the right places, to send the right signals to business, to transform away from a rent-based economy and towards a more productive market economy. You'd need a recalibration of the institutional mandates, for example, for the NOCs, and you see that already happening with some trying to transform themselves into energy companies, more sort of technology-led companies. And then there's the very, very tricky issue of addressing the social contract and public expectations, particularly in terms of the future of work and the importance of employment, and that's mirrored across the world, but there's perhaps particular opportunities for those countries where there were already the facilities in place to offer some kind of universal benefit to help ease that transition. And you've seen some of that playing out in various reform efforts in Iran and Saudi. And then there's industry and infrastructure adaptation and reconfiguration, firstly to sort of smooth that timeline a bit, so to rein in domestic consumption, which is essentially, potentially eating into your export, your oil and gas export potential. So to try and lengthen the time frame for transition a bit through, for example, use of renewables, much higher efficiency, and also think about the new, investment in a new type of infrastructure that is going to lead you, that's going to lead your economy into a much, into a very different place that meets the demands of that new industrial wave that we talked about. So last slide, please. So just to sum up, I've borrowed a few recommendations from the report that my colleague and I wrote 3 years ago on how countries can prepare, and that one was aimed at lower income developing countries and the ones we're talking about. But I think these have just been adapted a little bit, and I think they're still highly relevant to the more mature exporters in the MENA countries. Maybe we'll just concentrate in the interest of time on the last one, preparing the upstream for transition. As mentioned, there's this real need to adapt the incentives for institutions that manage and operate the upstream so that you create progressive vested interests, if you like, rather than regressive ones, and you help shift the vision, which is potentially about setting a timeline for winding down the sector altogether, or transforming it into something else. And that'll involve provisions for worker transitions. For some countries, it'll involve much faster decommissioning and all the kind of land remediation that might go with that. And there's also, and that can create industries in itself, can create opportunities in itself. And then there's, in the shorter term, which some of you have mentioned and Mark mentioned earlier, there's this building capacity to lower the emissions from the sector, and therefore reduce the intensity of the product as well as helping to meet NDC objectives, for example. So monitoring and managing emissions, including methane. There's ending flaring, plugging leakage, and applying more broadly applying carbon pricing to analysis, which some of the Gulf countries have been doing for some time anyway. So that's just in the upstream. I'm happy to answer questions on the other things, which are sort of much broader questions around economic reconfiguration, particularly in the balance of trade. And I suppose finally, we very strongly recommended in the work that we did. If you just turn to the last page, it might give the resources for that. So in these two, we very strongly recommended that countries use scenarios to help bring the different ministries together, especially ministries of finance, to look at how different scenarios might play out for a country, and to test their, not only their project plans, but investment plans, but also their revenue management strategies against those. Okay, thank you.
So thank you, Glada. There's a lot of food for thought in there. And just make one comment. I did notice a rather prominent flare in one of your slides. So just to let everyone on the call know that Ipieca, in conjunction with IOGP and the World Bank, the GGFR partnership, we're finalising our flaring management guidance. So I hope we'll be able to help industry reduce that flare and that waste of associated gas. And at that point, I'd like to move on to our next speakers. So I hand over to Dr. R.K. Malhotra from FIPI. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I hope you can listen to me.
Yeah, you're a bit faint, but we can hear you.
Okay, so maybe you can move
That's
to
better.
The first slide which I have. I've shared the slides. Yes. So this is the title of the presentation which I was supposed to give. Next, please. Next slide. Yeah, although this learned audience is already aware about how the global average temperatures have grown, as you can see that most of the increase has happened after 1975 or so. Essentially, next slide. Can help me with that? This was just to show graphically. Next. Next slide, please. Can somebody move it?
Is it?
Can you? Hello? Hello?
Yes. Is this the correct slide now?
Can you move to the next slide, please?
Which slide is on your screen?
Yeah. This is now clean. I think we have gone skipped 2 slides, but doesn't matter really. We can go to this slide also. The earlier 2 were well known to the people that the temperature has gone up and we need to control. I think this audience need not be told that we need to restrict it to 1.5 degrees C rather than 2 degrees C. Now on my screen, I can see that IEA slide. In the post-COVID scenario, when the clean energy investments have to be are expected to rebound. The IEA had expected that this COVID will impact 20% investments with implications for energy security and cleaner energy investments. But IEA also have been saying that the right government energy policies are critical for quick rebound and to create jobs, boost economy, and prepare for much cleaner, resilient, and modern energy sector. I think the COVID has shown all of us that we really have to move on. Whether this COVID was also an impact of climate change, I don't know. But this is a wake-up call by the nature, perhaps. And we have to have the right kind of energy policies in the post-COVID scenario and make it much cleaner, resilient, and modern energy sector. Recovery packages should include investments not in electricity alone, but also in hydrogen, carbon capture, and storage. That's the message from IEA. We have already discussed about the IEA message in earlier presentation about that the investments in the oil and gas sector should also be restricted. So IEA has been very clearly, focusing on moving quickly towards the clean energy investments. Next slide shows you about India's position in carbon emissions. As you might be aware that US emits more than 3 times its population share. If you talk about the global share of the carbon emissions, China emits significantly more than its population share, 29% of emissions versus 19% of the population, world population. India emits significantly less than its share, 7% of the total global emissions, while we have 18% of the global population. So per capita emissions from India are very low, and India's energy use and emissions are less than half of the world average on a per capita basis. But we are a developing economy. We are rapidly developing, and we have the rising aspirations of the growing middle class, which is bound to push the energy demand. And we have to cater to this energy demand while meeting the climate commitments. We are not saying that we will increase. Certainly, there will be increase in the energy demand in India with the growth which will happen, and also the aspirations of people. But we are also committed at the same time to meet the energy demand amidst the climate commitments in a responsible way. Next slide, please. Next. So India, in its intended nationally determined contribution submitted to UNFCCC after this Paris COP21, the pledge to curb greenhouse gas emissions with 3 major goals, which we have defined for us. They reduce carbon emissions intensity of GDP by 35% by 2030 from 2005 levels, and 40% cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel-based energy sources by 2030. So that's a big increase of renewables, which is bound to happen, on which we are working on track, and to create an additional carbon sink of about 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide through forest and tree cover by 2030. So these are the commitments which have been made as INDC targets. And next slide, please. If you can move to the next, yes. So according to India's Prime Minister, India's energy future has 4 pillars. Energy access, because we have not provided sufficient energy to our population. As I said earlier, the per capita consumption is low. Energy efficiency we need to focus upon because we want to do it in a responsible way. We don't want to increase the CO2 emissions. Energy sustainability, so that's where we will move towards more cleaner sources, and also the energy security, because we are net importers of oil and gas. We are also simultaneously working towards creating domestic renewable sources of energy, which will complement our commitments towards the climate change. So the government of India at highest level is committed to achieve the cleaner use of fossil fuels with focus on CCS technologies, accelerating efforts to move towards a gas-based economy rather than coal or oil-based, so that at least to some extent the emissions will go down further. Of course, the methane emissions, which were talked about earlier, need to be checked at the same time. The greater reliance on domestic sources, the biofuels, waste to energy, bioenergy, etc. These are some of the things on which great focus is being put in India. And renewables is one of the very major, solar energy is growing at a very rapid pace. The cost of per unit of electricity has fallen substantially during last few years, and the government has a target of about 450 gigawatt by 2030, which we are absolutely on track. And increasing contribution of electricity to decarbonize mobility, e-mobility incentives are being given, and also moving into emerging fuels, including hydrogen. So even refineries, oil and gas sector is also working towards hydrogen, and we also hope that side by side of the electric mobility, will have hydrogen fuel cell vehicles also, particularly for heavy duty transportation or heavy duty mobility. Hydrogen will offer better opportunities vis-a-vis the electric mobility. Can we go to the next slide, please? So our companies are, whether in the public sector or the private sector, both are behaving in a very responsible manner. and are committed towards the net zero emissions, and joining hands with the government to take toward the path of net zero. 24 big companies, the groups, the Tatas, Reliance, Mahindra, Adani, SR Oil and Gas, they have voluntarily pledged to move toward carbon neutrality. So that's the kind of commitment which the industry is making. With future cost of renewable energy dropping, as I said earlier also, substantially, the green hydrogen mission is being developed by the government. And Indian oil majors are looking at transformation into energy companies with focus on CCUS and hydrogen production. And they are also looking at transforming themselves from the oil and gas companies to energy companies in a meaningful manner. Indian Oil, which is the largest public sector oil company in the downstream side, is pursuing every energy transition possibilities, waste to energy, hydrogen, even hydrogen mixed with CNG is being experimented to some extent. Hydrogen, whatever can be produced, should be mixed with the natural gas, and oil to hydrogen, oil to chemicals, battery swapping facility, carbon to chemical, as I said, CCUS technology. Everything is being pursued by Indian Oil, the largest public sector oil company. And the Reliance Industries, the large private sector company, has announced a 2035 net zero target for their refineries, and they are saying that their refineries will become net zero refineries by 2035. In fact, they also imported the crude, which will enable them to become, net zero refinery much earlier than ahead of others. The Reliance Industries, besides operating large refineries in India, they are also setting up the 4 giga. Last month, in their annual general meeting, announcement was made that they will be setting up 4 gigafactories to make solar photovoltaic cells, green hydrogen production, batteries, and fuel cells over the next 3 years. And they have all the kind of resources, and large amount has been committed for setting up these units in Jamnagar, where they have already identified land, and money allocation has also been made. So growing number of net zero pledges, mission pledges by the companies reflects that the sense of urgency is there in Indian companies. Indian government is serious, Indian companies are serious, and they're accelerating momentum to around clean energy transition in India. Next slide, please, which I believe is the last slide. Thank you. So, and thanks again for the opportunity given to me to share the Indian perspective on how we are trying to move towards zero emission target. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malhotra. It's clear there's a huge amount going on in India. It doesn't always make the press, and it's great that you're able to share it with us. So at this point, I'll hand over to Anibal Kraga to talk about regional perspective and Africa. The floor is yours, Anibal.
Hi, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
All right, thanks, Jim. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to Ipieca for inviting me to make a presentation at this roundtable. My name is Anibal Kraga, and I'm the Executive Secretary of the African Refiners and Distributors Association, and over the next few minutes, I'm going to be sharing some of the challenges I believe Africa faces in light of the net zero emissions focus globally right now. I'll just start before I go into the presentation that we need to consider a couple of things from the IEA's net zero report. They were very clear that a clean energy transition must be fair and inclusive, and it should leave no one behind. And as a couple of folks, I believe Jim, you said this, and Glad of World Economic Forum also said there's no one-size-fits-all approach on this clean energy transition. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is what we call the case for action, what's kind of driving ardor over the next couple of years. And we start again with another IEA publication, the Africa Energy Outlook, which forecasted actually that for Africa, despite what's going on globally, fossil fuels demand is actually going to grow about 45% over the next 2 decades up to 2040. In fact, when you break down the primary energy mix, which is kind of shown on the top left chart, 60% of the primary energy mix for Africa over that period is going to be fossil fuels related. Simultaneously, 1 in 2 people born globally between now and 2040 is going to be African. So we're going to actually surpass India and China in population over the next couple of years. You look at the chart on the bottom left and you see that by 2035, we'll have at least 30 cities in Africa with 5 million or more people. So increased urban population, increased energy use is going to lead to increased pollution. As a result, we must have a coordinated transition to cleaner fuels. Otherwise, we're going to have a public health disaster on our hands. So the case for action essentially is that Africa's growing petroleum products demand must be met with cleaner fuels. And as a result, Africa must focus first on cleaner transport and cooking fuels before we embark on the broader global net zero emission energy transition plans. We support it, but we believe we have more near-term issues that we have to deal with first. Next slide, please. So I borrowed this chart from the IEA Net Zero Emissions Report, which shows the proposed, I will say the proposed global energy transition plan to net zero emissions by 2050. What the IEA was clear on is that this is a path, but not the path to net zero emissions, okay? Everyone has to find their way to a destination that works for them. So this is very clear. It covers, what industry, transport, buildings, and other key things are, how they expect it to progress if many, many stars align. They were very clear on that. A lot of things have to happen for this to take place. But again, this pathway is global, but each country and by association, each region must show and develop their own designated path. I'm very happy the previous speaker from FIPI actually showed what India is doing. And I believe each African country, but also Africa as a region, needs to come together to develop their own unique energy transition plan or plans. It's not very clear how we're going to go about this, but we have some ideas of how they can progress. Next slide, please. So a couple of considerations, and this starts to talk to what I believe Paul and Rory were talking about. What are the financial considerations, technological and other considerations that we must look at as we're developing an energy transition plan for the downstream? First of all, based on the factors I mentioned, should Africa focus on reducing our air pollution in the near term via cleaner fuels, or do we focus on energy transition via technology that right now is still on the expensive side and it's more or less unproven? I mean, if you look at what was said in the IEA report, you have 4 stages of technology, right? Prototype, demonstration, market uptake, and maturity. And when you look at the innovation that has to take place for the net zero emissions to be reached, right? For electrification, which is the biggest one, they've done pretty well, but 30% of the technology that's going to be required for emissions is still in prototype or demo stage. For hydrogenation, 75% of the technology that's going to deliver the emissions that they're projecting is still in prototype or demo stage. For carbon capture and storage, 55% of that technology is still in demo or prototype stage. And for bioenergy, 45%. So in our view, the limited public funding that Africa has, I think it was projected in some of the earlier presentations that if you reduce investment in natural resources, public funding is going to go down. So how should we spend what we have in the near term while we develop longer, broader energy transition plans? And we believe they should focus on cleaner transport and cooking fuels first and the associated distribution infrastructure, while working on separate financing frameworks on promoting cleaner power and fuel initiatives. Right now, the global focus is on power, electricity, which is of course very important, but we need to ensure that there are also financial pathways and frameworks for the other initiatives, particularly on clean fuels and renewables as well. On the technology standpoint, I've already pointed out, majority of the technology required for net zero emissions is still in development or prototype stage. We can't afford in Africa right now to make this technological jump to replace our cooking and transport fuels now with renewables. I mean, we will keep them in view and we'll build them into gradual transition plans. I'll touch on that a bit later. And once the renewables technology is more proven, it's more mature and more cost effective because the price is going down, we can adopt them later. I must also point out that governments must prioritize policies that actually make all of this possible. But for now, as I mentioned, to avoid these public health and environmental issues, we must focus on policies that support cleaner air, fuels, and vehicles at this time. We also have complex, inefficient supply chains at this point, right? So actually deploying these technologies currently is not really feasible. How do we get the infrastructure in place, put in place the policies to address the inter-country tariffs and the like that would impede implementation of cost-effective clean energy solutions down the line? Luckily, we have the Africa Continental Free Trade Act, which has been signed and which is being pushed in a very strong fashion now, and that presents an opportunity for the African Union and all its member states, as well as the regional economic commissions, to implement harmonized energy transition plans across the continent. Next slide, please. So what should energy transition look like? We believe that we should have separate energy transition plans for transport and cooking fuels, for new renewable energy, and also for power. Power is getting the focus right now, but we actually need to have, in our view, 3 separate plans, and we must have the policies and public funding and financing put behind this to ensure we have success. On the transport and cooking fuels, call me biased, but of course we do need to upgrade our refineries to produce cleaner, low sulfur fuels. We're working with the African Union Commission on going to 10 ppm or Euro 5 equivalent fuels. We call it AFRI6 by 2030. We need to have a clear focus on replacing biomass with LPG. LPG for clean cooking, we believe, is the best short near-term initiative that we can use to reduce our carbon footprint. And we need to also develop the storage and distribution infrastructure to make that happen. For the new energies or the renewable energies, we are supporting biofuels. In fact, in the near term, we believe that we should look at things like bio-LPG for municipal waste, given the urban population numbers we'll be talking about. We think that's very important. We also will be looking, keeping in view ammonia, hydrogen, as well as sustainable aviation fuels, but we think there should be a separate transition plan for that. And last but not least, power, getting a lot of support at this point in time, but we think the near-term focus should be on focusing on natural gas mainly, but also some renewables as near-term cleaner primary energy sources for Africa as we look to replace coal and oil. We must also upgrade the transmission lines. There's a lot of stranded power across Africa. How do we get the transmission lines upgraded so that we can actually deliver the power where it needs to go? And we cannot be talking of electric vehicles where, as I'm sitting with you right now, I have a generator. I have an inverter. I'm working on getting solar panels, but the power has gone off 3 times during this call. So we can't be talking of electric vehicles when I can't even get power in my house, and industries don't even have consistent power. Next slide, please. So this slide is more for Patrick and Rory, and this is kind of like, this is for illustrative purposes only, and I must point that out. But this is kind of what we think investment should look like. Call it a tale of 3 decades, where we have a decade by decade plan for how energy transition to take place. First decade is now up to 2030, and relatively we think the focus should be on cleaner transport and cooking fuels. Let's upgrade our refineries, distribution infrastructure and the like. Let's do some LPG for clean cooking and start to look at things like bio-LPG, municipal waste. We think that has a place and that should start to come up. The next decade, 2030 to 2040, that should have focus, real push LPG for clean cooking, regional storage and distribution infrastructure. We should have coordination such that we can have ports, rail, pipelines, all of that put in place to support this energy transition. Biofuels as well, gas to power, huge, we should focus on that. And then the renewables technology that actually is more mature, solar and normal wind technology, we think will be good. The last decade, then by now, we've had a lot of technological innovation. A lot of this renewables technology is now proven. The cost has gone down. It's been tested. We can now afford to spend put majority of our investments into renewables, into the the biofuels, into the mature offshore wind, CCUS, and the like, as well as proven energy technology. So this is essentially what we feel is how we should look at it: a tale of 3 decades, where you have clear energy transition plans for the 3 separate things I mentioned earlier: transport and cooking fuels, renewable energy and power, and then you ramp up investments in each area across the decade as technology becomes more and more mature and more cost effective. Last slide, please. So in summary, I just want to take away a few things. One, Africa's growing energy demand must be met first with cleaner fuels because of the public health issues I mentioned. The proposed IEA net zero emissions transition plan is a great proposal, but it's not one size fits all. The African case is unique and it's not clear at this point. We are not able to leapfrog cleaner fuel technology at this time to renewables. We can't afford it. And we need to ensure, of course, that we put in place the policies that will make this happen. We need separate implementation strategies for cleaner transport and cooking fuels, for lower carbon power initiatives, as well as renewable energy solutions. And last but not the least, we need measured decade by decade sustainable finance plans to ensure that the investments are made to deliver on our unique African energy transition plans. That's pretty much it. Next slide. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward to any questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Glada, Dr. Malhotra, and Anibal. That's been really fascinating and shows that I guess the energy transition is multifaceted. It's more complex than you hear in the Western Anglophone media on a daily basis. So it's great to be exposed to those different ideas and those different needs from parts of the world in the energy transition. I'm conscious of the fact that we're running rather late, and I'd like to move quickly into our final session where we cover industry initiatives. The first two presenters are Brian Sullivan of Ipieca and Julian Perez of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. We'll talk about what the oil and gas industry is doing already and what still needs to be done. I won't steal their thunder, but I will say if you could speak quickly and briefly, that would be much appreciated. And then to round out the session, and I'm sorry, John, that you're going to be last, but John Rivas of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development will broaden the discussion about what business community is and should be doing as a whole to meet the Paris Agreement and in the context of sustainable development. And I think it's somewhat fitting to have a final speaker in the lineup whose title is Director of Net Zero Transformation. That's a wonderful title. So go ahead, Brian.
Great, thanks, Jim, and thanks to all the previous speakers. So I'm going to talk about how Ipieca, encouraged by its members and stakeholders, is responding to the challenges using examples from our members as we go forward. Next slide, please, Jack. So I will not spend a lot of time on this one, but because I think it echoes a lot of the comments that have been said earlier. But I think the important thing is that Ipieca members actually recognise they have a crucial role to play in the global challenge of access to energy while moving towards net zero emissions. And the industry gets and understands that there are sustainability challenges facing the sector and that the industry must continue to scale up its climate change action, curbing emissions from global energy production and use, and continue to play its part in a world aspiring to net zero emissions. Next slide, please, Jack. And we're well positioned to help our members respond to these challenges. We've just launched a new strategy in 2021 with energy transition and sustainable development at the heart of our work. And you can see our new vision there, which includes reference to energy transition and sustainable development right at the headline. And our strategy is about 4 key themes: climate, nature, people and sustainability. And our work focuses on climate action, environmental responsibility, social performance and mainstreaming sustainability. Next slide, please, Jack. One of the biggest questions in our recent strategy review, and we spent a lot of time talking to members and stakeholders about this, was what is the role of Ipieca, what traditionally an oil and gas industry association, in the energy transition. And bearing in mind that obviously our members are predominantly from the oil and gas industry, although they're diversifying rapidly, and our core competencies are on environmental and social good practice. And the answer was to leverage the breadth of Ipieca's convening power and experience to support key enablers of the pathway to a low emissions future. And so for a number of aspects of the energy transition, and not just those which are the core businesses of our members, we have an opportunity to add value through sharing our knowledge and experience in environmental and social good practice in support of factors of the energy transition. So this includes as well as convening the industry for good practice within the industry in support of pathways to a net zero world, sharing good practice beyond the oil and gas sector. There's a lot of social good practice which is applicable way beyond oil and gas, and likewise on the environmental side. The other thing, other elements there, we're going to be convening the industry on the just transition, and this work has started now and it's working at pace across our membership. And our newest task force for Ipieca, which has met for the first time a couple of weeks ago, is our Alternative Energy Task Force. And this will be focusing primarily or initially on solar, wind and biofuel projects, and looking at good environmental and social practice to support progress on those projects to make sure that they don't have to reinvent the wheel, learn from mistakes where there is good practice and experience that's already well known out there. Next slide, please. So within our climate theme and led by our climate change group, we have a strategy for each theme, and the strategy for climate is of course recognizing that in a world aspiring to a net zero future, our role is to advance members' contribution to pathways to a resilient low emissions future and uphold Ipieca's position as part of the dialogue on energy transition. And this includes leading engagement with the UN and other stakeholders in support of the Paris Agreement. And I will add here that we have reiterated and reconfirmed in our strategy that we will continue to remain a non-lobby organisation. So we don't lobby governments and we don't lobby for or against specific policies. The other thing we'll be doing is convene the industry to enable emissions reductions and a positive contribution to the energy industry. And we'll also collaborate to explore and enable low emissions pathways and scale up of solutions, working with the industry and working with stakeholders in this area. Next slide, please. So just as there's no single pathway to meet the Paris aims, and we've heard that several times from various perspectives earlier on in the call today, there's no single pathway for a net zero future for individual oil and gas companies because they have their own portfolios, their own stakeholders, and they have to take into account the development needs of individual countries. So there's no one single answer or scenario in this particular area. But despite all this, we've noted three main elements that are common to most of the projected pathways for the energy transition. So the first, most cost-effective method of reducing greenhouse gas emissions is, of course, to become more energy efficient. And this bears repeating over and over again. Second, reducing the greenhouse gas intensity of power generation can lead to the electrification of other parts of the economy, such as light-duty passenger cars or 2- or 3-wheeler transport, and electrification for space heating and cooling. And then finally, there's reducing emissions in other parts of the economy which are harder to abate, including elements such as industry, heavy industry, who may well move on to carbon capture, use and storage, or aviation and shipping, who may switch to biofuels and hydrogen. But while the world's energy system must be transformed to drive a low carbon future, people still need access to energy today. And while renewable energy is rapidly scaling up, the world will, for some time to come, need the energy provided by oil and gas. And that's why we need to produce oil and gas with as low emissions as possible, while also growing renewables and developing low carbon solutions. Next slide, please. So to further support the membership and the sector, we've developed an SDG roadmap that provides a common vision for our sector in support of the SDGs. We did this together with in partnership with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and we launched it a couple of months ago back in April. And it identifies 8 impact opportunities where our industry can join together to accelerate action under 3 themes of climate, nature and people. And our aim is to inspire collaboration within the industry to support achievement of the SDGs and the aims of the Paris Agreement. The energy industry has a key role to play on the road to achieving a common vision for the future set out by the Sustainable Development Goals. but the goals are too big for any one actor to achieve alone, so they will require concerted efforts across all pillars of society, government, business and civil society, and partnerships and collaboration are going to be key to success. The energy transition and the pursuit of net zero is an important part of the sustainability agenda, but not the whole picture. And we must remember that sustainable development also encompasses environmental, social and economic issues. And the roadmap aims to help our sector focus its efforts, and every one of us in the sector can make a difference. Next slide, please. So while I encourage everyone to browse through the roadmap themselves, it's available on our website. I'm sharing here a few examples of how Ipieca and also companies from the sector can make a difference. And I think some of them align quite well with the challenges set for the sector by Mark in his keynote earlier in the session today. So it includes actions looking at adopting methane intensity reduction targets consistent with the best available methodology. It includes actions to support the aims of the World Bank Zero Routine Flaring by 2030 initiative, and also actions to look at increasing access to energy and the accompanying benefits associated with it, such as improved air quality for local communities, such as Aribor mentioned just now. Next slide, please, Jack. So focusing on the area of net zero emissions, you can see on the slide the topics that Ipieca is working on are all contributors in that particular area. And in most of the topics on the left, we've been working on these areas for a while, and we've produced guidance documents, fact sheets, we've arranged webinars and workshops on a wide range of topics in here. But there are a few recent additions like the just transition and also a strengthened focus on nature-based solutions, including looking at how good practice from a biodiversity and also social responsibility point of view can be taken into account with those. And of course, you'll see on there alternative energy. And in 2021, we have an active work programme on net zero as a concept in itself. And all of these topics on the left are somehow contributing to it. So in our net zero task force, the two main aims are to provide an opportunity for Ipieca to convene and disseminate knowledge and good practice for members in the area of net zero emissions as one of the key elements of the energy transition and low emissions pathways, and to educate and inform our members and stakeholders as to how the different threads of the energy transition fit together, and how the oil and gas sector is responding, and where opportunities may lie to progress and also gain wider stakeholder participation in this. And this webinar is a great example. And then moving on to my last slide here. So here we go. 24 of our members, just over half of Ipieca's company membership, have publicly declared net zero ambitions. A year ago, it was 2. And before that, it was 0. So there's a lot of progress being made, and it's very rapid. And progress, I think, that is quite helpful if we think about Mark's challenge for the sector back at the beginning of this event. But much like the national net zero pledges that you were hearing in the run-up to COP26, there is a diversity of approaches at the moment around baselines, timing, scope, trajectory, strategies. No single pathway, as I mentioned earlier. But the direction is clear, and the need and urgency for the world to achieve it is well understood. Thanks, and I'll hand back to Jim now.
Thank you, Brian. Move swiftly on. Julien, I hope you're still on the line.
Yeah, I'm there.
So Julien followed by John. So go ahead, Julien.
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and I'll try to cover those very quickly. First of all, I wanted to thank you. I think it's a fantastic panel that you brought together, and the discussion were extremely interesting. So thank you very much, and thanks for inviting us. So if you can move on to the next slide for just wanted to use this slide as well to echo some of the message that came out from the previous discussion. So for those of you who don't know us, OGCI is a smaller organization than Ipieca. We only have 12 companies. We are led by the CEOs, and that means that real engagement from the CEOs, like roll up their sleeves and engage approximately on a quarterly basis to run the OGCI. And among the 12 companies that we have, of course, we have the renowned IOCs such as BP, Shell, Eni, or Repsol. But more importantly, we also embark at the NOCs such as Aramco, Petrobras, and CNPC. And I think having the NOCs around the table for us is really key. They cover, the vast majority of the reserves, sometimes at the lowest net cost of production. And so by embarking the NOCs, we also embark the producing countries. And this is critical because, as it has been said by the previous panelist, what we don't want is simply to displace the issue from IOCs to NOCs. IOCs can act and do act today, but if the result is just divestment, it would be probably not really good for the climate at the end of the day. So the focus of OGCI is to focus where we are additional. So we try to build up on the unique combination of skill set the industry can provide, and particularly our member. So an international presence, a deep understanding of the energy system, capacity to run large projects with complex engineering parameters, of course, an offshore presence and subsurface knowledge. And that means that we focus mainly on the hard to scale up solution. And you can see here the 6 focus areas that we have on our agenda, notably on the CCUS, the role of gas, and particularly how to tackle the methane emission. I think that the presentation from Mark was very clear on the importance of that topic. On the transport side, we look in particular on the heavy duty vehicle, the marine transport, or the aviation. So again, the one that are difficult to abate. Energy efficiency, we will look mainly on the scope within the industry sector, and notably on our industry. As well as we address the natural climate solution and what we call the low emission opportunity, which is more think tank and looking at different future opportunity for GCI and the scenarios. And the last aspect I would like to mention as well is that OGCI again focus its agenda on that. We try to play a role of catalyst to accelerate the transformation of our members through knowledge sharing and create disincentives for our members. But also we try to identify what we can do as a coalition that none of the company, OGCI member or not, could do individually at the speed and the scale that is needed by the Paris Agreement. Maybe one thing that I would like to echo from what Glada and Dr. Malorta and Anibor just reminding us is the reality happening on the ground in producing a large growing economy. So for sure, there is no one size fits all. And for us, it's very, very important to be boots on the ground and deliver very concrete action to embark the countries in what makes sense for a fair and just future and demonstrate the business value. So that's why we're very much action oriented. And for instance, you have an example here of our investment fund that was launched a few years after the launch of OGCI. The initiative is pretty young. We were born back in 2014, a year ahead of the COP in Paris, and a few years after we were launching this 1 billion fund. This is just one example of a very practical action that we try to implement to sort the challenge this faced by the energy. And again, echoing what was said before, addressing it as a system. It's not something that you can do in isolation of the economy, of the demand, of the government's energy strategy, etc. It's something that we try to address as a system. So just to save a little bit of time, I'm going to skip the next slide, and if you can jump on the following one. So yeah, thanks a lot. So here are just a few examples of action that we intend to deliver on our agenda. So as you can see, we've tried to categorize them on various type of colors and topics. But let me just guide you through some of them. So, for instance, on the methane aspect, so we have released the targets, which is an intensity targets that serve as a benchmark and also as a coalition of players allow us to absorb the variation of portfolio of our membership. And the target is basically to reduce by 1/3 in 7 years the intensity of the methane emission for the upstream production. And of course, if the demand and the production of gas remain steady, you could easily translate this intensity into an absolute impact. And that would correspond basically on the reduction of 1/3 as well, obviously. In terms of action as well, we are launching a satellite data acquisition for the countries where the challenge is hard to address. We know that there is a handful of countries where methane emissions are supposed to be very high, and what we would like to do is to provide them the capacity to acquire satellite-based information and so to drive down their methane emission based on robust information, and so design the appropriate policy. We also address the data accuracy thanks to technology testing, deployment, internal knowledge sharing, contribute to large programs such as the Flaring Survey satellite from the World Bank, or the development of very practical guidance, including one that we are doing with Ipieca and the IOGP on how to practically deploy the existing and the incumbent technology to reconcile bottom-up and top-down approach. And also we expand, and we very much value partnership. As I mentioned earlier, we tend to address this challenge as a system challenge and not something that you can do in isolation. And so partnering for us is extremely important to maximize the multiplier effect. And we do partner with country, coalition, institution, think tank, university, or the rest of the value chain. So this is just for the methane, but on the CCUS, we also have 8 hubs in our portfolio that we try to scale up. That's going to deliver several million tons of CO2 in the next few years, and demonstrate as well the existence of various profitable business case. We've launched a global search where we covered 52 countries through an algorithm that combine the sources of emission, the storage capacity, and optimize the decarbonization option for industrial hubs using CCUS. And actually what that shows is that we have identified approximately 100 hubs that emit roughly 1 gigaton of CO2 per year, and that could be abated using CCUS option at less than $100 per ton. And the next stage for us is to scale up some of those hubs and to push the agenda to make them happen in a concrete manner and in a short-term manner. Similarly, we've launched a CO2 storage catalog where we combine the knowledge of our members thanks to also literature sources, etc., etc. This you can get access to all of that in our website, because our idea, of course, is to maximize our impact. I'm not going to roll out all the other examples, but I'm very happy to take them later on bilaterally or during the Q&A if we have time. One last slide that I wanted just to pick up as well, if you can move on to the next one, is about the work that we are conducting on the net zero perspective. So what we're doing is internally we're sharing some best practices among our members, but also making some literature review on what is the net zero practices of the industry and what are the best practices that we could realistically implement in the short time frame. And of course, I mean, most of it have been said, but something that just wanted to highlight as well is the importance of addressing the challenge of the non-operated aspect and the equity consolidation, because this is something that we definitely need to address as an industry, and something that we are seriously looking at within GCI and with our member companies. Coupling absolute with intensity, I think it's important. Absolute reduction have value, intensity as well, just to serve as a benchmark for the rest of the industry and to drive down the emission. Again, keep in mind that IOCs is the smaller portion of the reserve. The big portion is the NOCs, and where, of course, the influence of stakeholder and investor is more limited. So if we are not able to set intensity and benchmark for those players, we'll never crack the issue. Having also the capacity to develop short-term target, this is something that we very much value at GCI, as you probably have understood now, as well as, of course, align with decarbonization scenario and follow also a mitigation hierarchy. So you start by avoiding, then you mitigate, and then for what you cannot avoid or mitigate, then you start to look at the offset option. So that few lessons learned that we have drawn from our research that I think are quite aligned with what has been said. And with that, I'll stop there, Jim. I'm hoping that I've not consumed too much of the time.
No, thank you very much, Julian. Lots of excellent ideas in there, in particular in your areas around best practices. And I'll move over to John from the World Business Council. Sorry for being so late in the timetable, but John, please go ahead.
Well, and I will, and I don't know how much time we have available, because your participants have all been very resilient, but I'm sure after 2.5 hours, it's time to stop looking at a screen. Maybe we can go to slide 6 quickly. I'll just show 3 slides. I won't introduce WBCST to you, but I just would like to, thank you, just illustrate that I have 2 projects I wanted to share with you. One is called SOS 1.5, where we are helping our members achieve their net zero target. So we're a member-based organization, Many of Ipieca members are also WBCSD members, and we support our members with practical tools, collaboration opportunities, and a safe space to be honest about their challenges and work out how we can support one another. If you go to the next slide, keep going. One more. Just one more, and then just to show you what's inside the program. So we help support our members to accelerate their own climate journey and support in terms of taxonomy. And for example, WBCSD, we sit on the advisory committee for SBTI, and we are part of the Secretariat for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and currently about to start piloting the new greenhouse gas protocol guidelines for removals. So I'd be delighted to work with any of your members on that. Please do contact me. And then we have these Pathfinder areas where we bring together the most ambitious companies to think about the challenges to tackle together. We have a carbon transparency partnership focused on Scope 3 emissions. So you will know that your biggest challenge is actually to understand what your Scope 3 emissions are. And we are creating a allocation methodology together with a way of being able to support the whole supply chain in reliably using primary data to build up a final carbon footprint of product based on primary data. Secondly, we've just started some work on avoided emissions, and that may be of high interest to your members as well, looking at climate benefits for products, technologies, and services. And it's a bit, as you know, companies are adopting, and there isn't a standard methodology for them to measure, report, and communicate the climate benefits arising from the use of their innovative products and technologies. The last, if you could go forward a couple of slides, I'd just like to bring to your attention, go through that one. We haven't got time. I'm sure you'll all be interested in that. Keep going. The slide I'm interested is slide 13 on natural climate solutions. So on Thursday, we'll be launching some really important guidance from the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance. This is a cross-industry, multi-stakeholder forum. It's taken nearly 2 years to come up with an agreed understanding of what best practice looks like for corporates. What does high quality NCS credits look like? And we hope this will be a reference document that can be used for corporates and from many similar organizations. I know we're over time, but I hope that's given you a feel for our work, which is really there to offer practical support and work collectively on the solutions we need to achieve net zero. I can't do it quicker than that, Jim.
John, that's absolutely perfect. And I think there's kind of two things, if I can pick out from that. One is about, if you like, aspects of sustainability reporting, which is a long-standing focus area of Ipieca, and also natural climate solutions, nature-based solutions, which is something that featured very highly in the survey and the peer learning sessions that Ipieca members had around net zero. That natural climate solutions are of paramount importance. So if you don't mind, I'll apologize for kind of shortening your presentation, but we will pick up with you if that's okay.
Please do, and I look forward to it. And of course, your members will have access to the whole presentation.
But certainly we'd like to have a much more in-depth discussion, probably around natural climate solutions once the launch of the guidelines are there. So that's excellent. So just kind of remains for me to say thank you all. Sorry for going over the time contract. And as mentioned in the introduction, a recording, a PDF version of the slides and a short summary of the roundtable will be made available to all registrants. Apologies for the technical glitches at the beginning and as a moderator for running behind schedule. so there wasn't much time for Q&As. So it just remains for me to kind of thank you all, the presenters and the participants alike, particularly those who are here at the end, for an excellent roundtable, for introducing such a wide range of ideas and perspectives around net zero and the energy transition. And I'd like to finish with a reference to the Sustainable Development Goals. And in this decade of action for the SDGs, SDG 17 covers partnerships and collaboration. And if you look at the IEA net zero roadmap, it indicates that in the journey to net zero, that will be much more challenging and take much longer in the absence of international cooperation. And I hope this roundtable will be part of the continuing and the successful collaboration between stakeholders and the oil and gas industry moving forward. So thank you all very much and have a great rest of the day. And look out for some more ideas that we've got around webinars that fit into the net zero energy transition. So thank you all, and call the roundtable to a close. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.